Jonathan White. Hi, Jonathan.
Hello, how are you?
I'm fine. And Jared's quiet. Jared,
Hello.
how are
Good morning.
you? Two of our star guides with the company, in the Burr the company, for years. And topic of the jour is, well, what's going to happen with our tours when we're going to reopen everything? Jonathan, are you looking forward?
I'm very much looking forward to it. I've been
I am
trapped
so
in my
pumped.
house and I want to get out.
I want to talk to people, right?
I want to talk to people other than the people in my house.
I think that when we're going to start the tours again, the added quality for everybody is that I'm expecting we're going to have smaller groups. And already we're one of the company that has the lowest ratio of, guides to guests. It's going to be even better. And for us, guess what? That's going to save our voice a little bit. We won't have to yell so much. Jared, what are you missing from touring these days?
What am I missing?
Uh-huh.
Well, like both of you, I enjoy the interaction. I enjoy meeting people from all over the world. That's the greatest thing about being a New York City tour guide is you meet people from all over the world. I miss teaching. Essentially, a tour guide, you're teaching, and you're also having fun, but you're teaching. And to take off on what you just said, how things will change is still a wait and see issue. But I think it's going to take a while for the throngs of people to return. So by definition, we should have smaller groups, at least initially.
Yeah.
And the theory is that it's like, like medical care. If you have 10 people in a group or 12 people in a group versus 18 or 20 or 25 in a group, that you get more attention, that, you're able to ask more questions, that you're, able to get a little more out of the experience if there's less people involved. So in that sense, it should be good. It should be a good development.
And that's going to be, I always said that in touring, there is a sweet number of people where when you go over, you're losing in the experience. When you go under, you don't have that group interaction. And already it was good with, the number that we used to have in tours. And now it's going to be even better. So it's something to look forward to.
Yeah.
Also, something that I discussed in my the last time that I was on, my feeling is we're going to have a lot of New Yorkers, people from New York City, which is very, very exciting because I feel that we're going to be able to get much more into the meat of the subject. Right, John, you were talking a little bit about Hamilton and such, which we never have chance to talk much other than, here's his final resting place.
It's interesting. I totally agree. I mean, I feel that obviously local people are going to be more likely to come out than people getting on planes who have to get on planes to come over here to do tours. And it's interesting because back before coronavirus, right? In the old days when I had
BC.
BC.
Before coronavirus.
BC, right? In the BC era, a group of New Yorkers and local people on the tours was always a slightly different experience because you had people who actually did know something about the topic. They'd just never gotten into it in depth. As a matter of fact, that's why they were on the tours. So it was almost kind of like going out and hanging out with your next door neighbors or somebody from around the block. It's a very different dynamic. Not that the dynamic of people who aren't sort of basically familiar with the material isn't good, but it was just a very different dynamic. And so it'll be interesting to sort of explore that.
Right, not only that, it's because a lot of time in our tours, we just, we don't go too deep in the subject because of just what you said, but also having like real New Yorkers, mainly for tours like the Wall Street tour that we offer, the financial crisis and the insider tours. We're going to have a lot of people in New York who actually lived through those moments, and they will be able to actually bring a lot of information that we may not know and share with the entire group, which is going to be, very important and interesting, at
That's
least for us, the guides, hopefully for the rest of the group. What do
That's
you
great.
think, Jared?
Well, what I have to say is that BC, before coronavirus, 90% of the time that you get a New Yorker on the tour, they had someone from out of town visiting them. And, oh, let's go out to the Statue of Liberty. Let's go to the 9/11 Memorial. Let's go to Wall Street. Let's go to Central Park. But they were sort of going on the tour because they had an out of town visitor and they had to come up with something for them to do.
True.
And it was always a great thrill to have a New Yorker on the tour, because you could almost tell at the beginning of the tour, they were, these native New Yorkers are like, well, I know everything about this. I'm just doing this for my out of town visitor. But as they started to realize throughout the course of the tour that they were learning stuff that they never knew, you could see that their eyes were opening up. And by the end of the tour, I often got, handshakes and people saying, oh, thank you so much. I never realized how much there was to it. I mean, New Yorkers, they know the restaurants, they know how to get around on the subway, they know what they read in the papers. They're very sophisticated. They know how to shop. But boy, you tell them about Alexander Hamilton, you tell them about the history of the Revolutionary War in New York, and they're pretty clueless. So it's a great feeling to get a New Yorker on the tour, because they start out with this know-it-all attitude. And by the end of the tour, they're like converts to how much they've learned.
And they became more interested in history themselves after that, and seeing and now knowing how rich the history is in New York City. It's absolutely everywhere. You're absolutely right.
That's the second
Jared.
best thing, Benoit, is about being a New York City tour guide, is, other than all the people you meet, is you never learn at all. And
True.
you're constantly in a process of learning. I have what is called the 80-20 rule, which is I find I can answer about 80% of my clients' questions right off the bat. Excuse me. Right off the bat, I can answer 80% of the questions. But 20%, I need to go to Google, or I need to do some additional research.
True.
And that's what makes it a second reason such a great job, is you're constantly learning. And it's just a great opportunity to be fulfilled.
I would second that. This is that's probably my favorite aspect of doing this. Whether it comes from guest questions or just things that you are explaining, and you realize that there's a whole nother window there that you've looked out of, but you haven't really gone out the window, and realizing, well, let me enhance the experience for the next group of people. And you go home and you go down the rabbit hole of Google and start doing some research. It's an endless but endlessly satisfying thing about this job.
Yeah, and it's bringing more depth to your tour, basically, because sometimes you're going to use this that story in your tour.
Absolutely. Like, for instance, until I met Jared, I didn't know who Alexander Hamilton was.
What a segue, John.
And he told me all about Alexander Hamilton.
Yeah,
It was the most fascinating set of information.
Whether you wanted to learn about him or not,
but I did. He's on the $10 bill. The more I know about him, I figure the more $10 bills I'd have.
Well,
there's so much.
Well,
really?
I am a member of the Hamilton Society, which is the fan club dedicated to Alexander Hamilton. So if it's okay with you guys, I will give about a 5-minute introduction into his life and why I find him to be one of the absolute most interesting of the founding fathers. I would describe Alexander Hamilton as a Renaissance man.
And Jared, can I just interrupt you for 1 second?
Certainly.
What I think is super important is that when you're walking around downtown, right? And this is something that I learned from you when you told me about Alexander Hamilton. I mean, this guy's presence, as important as he was, is all over downtown.
The question always is where to begin. So with Hamilton, I simply do it in a chronological order, because his whole life is so fascinating. You know, when you think of the founding fathers, you think of, you know, Washington and Jefferson and Adams and, you know, James Madison and these people that, you know, signed the Declaration of Independence and came up with these wonderful institutions of democracy and won our independence. But with Hamilton, he's so different than most of the other founding fathers. He was born in the island of Nevis in the Caribbean. We're not sure of the date, 1755, 1757. He was born the son of a minor Scottish lord who had moved to the Caribbean, but unfortunately failed in the sugarcane plantation business. He failed in the sugarcane business. So his father actually returned to Scotland. And Alexander Hamilton did not have an easy childhood because his parents were not married. At that time, it was considered a giant social stigma to be the child of unmarried parents. Of course, in today's world, nobody cares if your parents were married when you were born or not. But at that time, it was a social stigma. And his mother had all sorts of problems. She died when he was 10 years old. He was sent to live with a cousin of his who committed suicide, if you can believe this, when Alexander Hamilton was just 13 years of age. So, and in addition to this horrible upbringing, because of this horrible circumstances of his difficulty of his childhood, he was not accepted into the local Christian school because of this stigma of unmarried parents. He was a quote unquote bastard, right? And it was actually a Jewish yeshiva that accepted him, even though Alexander Hamilton was not Jewish. He was educated. Oh, here's a wonderful
Oh, that's nice.
Yay!
Thank you, Fareed. I assume our number one expert back there helping us with the Alexander Hamilton portrait, which is used on the $10 bill. But he was accepted into a Jewish yeshiva, even though he wasn't Jewish. And so that's where he got his early education. By the time he was an early teenager, he was forced to go to work because his cousin had died and committed suicide. And he went to work in the trading houses of St. Croix in what is now the U.S. Virgin Islands. And he was so good as a negotiator. He was negotiating with captains that were twice his age in the import-export business. And the local community of St. Croix recognized that this was a very bright young man. And so what they did is they sponsored him. They sent him, they paid for his passage, excuse me, they paid for his passage up to New York. And he arrived in 1774, 1775. And they had paid him essentially to go to school. They wanted him to get, education, and he essentially became a student at what is called King's College, now known as Columbia University. But the appropriate thing was the arrival and the timing of the arrival. I mean, he arrived in the U.S., the proper continental U.S. in New York, just as the revolutionary mindset is really heating up. And he recognized that in war, that as a military officer, his social stigma, excuse me, folks, the social stigma of his family upbringing would not matter. In other words, if he could prove himself as a military officer, he could rise above this social stigma. And that is exactly what happened. He was commissioned a captain in the artillery known as the Hearts of Oak. And he was so effective as an artillery officer that he caught the attention of General Washington, who was, of course, the commander-in-chief of the American Continental Army, who plucked him for his general staff, gave him a promotion of 2 ranks to lieutenant colonel. He was his aide-de-camp. Hamilton was General Washington's aide-de-camp. And by the end of the American Revolutionary War, he was such a trusted advisor of Washington that Washington chose him as the battalion commander at the Battle of Yorktown, Virginia, which ended the fighting in the American Revolutionary War. So he was absolutely right on to recognize that he could rise above his social stigma by military prowess. After the war, of course, and I'll go through this rather quickly because I don't want to take the entire session dedicated to my passion of Alexander Hamilton. But after the war, of course, he was the first Treasury Secretary, and that's why his picture appears, the painting here that everybody is seeing on screen, appears on the $10 bill. And if you look on the rear of the $10 bill, it's the US Treasury, because Hamilton was the first Secretary of the Treasury. In fact, there's only two people never elected president of the United States on our paper currency, on the currency, and that is Hamilton on the $10 bill and Franklin on the $100 bill. And then, of course, Harriet Tubman will be on the $20 bill in a few years. She will be the third person never elected president. But in order to not be a president and be on our currency, you got to be someone special. And it's not a accident that there's the Treasury on the back of the $10 bill, because as the first Treasury Secretary, he was given the nickname the Father of Finance, because he recognized the need for a strong sort of central banking system, and he issued government bonds to pay for the war debt incurred by the individual states during the Revolutionary War. That's how the states were made whole, by bonds that were issued, US government bonds that were issued, and then very ironically, mainly bought by European bankers in London who he had just finished a war with. But he essentially repaired the damage to the states' economies through the in the American Revolutionary War by issuing these bonds. And he recognized the power of finance, right? As a private individual, he was one of the founders of the Bank of New York. He was the founder of the New York Post newspaper. He was the founder of the first industrial park in the country at Patterson Falls, New Jersey. He is credited with being the founder of the Coast Guard, because as Treasury Secretary, he issued the order to purchase about 200 ships. So founding the Coast Guard. He was also a great leader of the anti-slavery movement. New York State, along with Pennsylvania, were the first major states to prohibit slavery 38 years before the end of the American Civil War, which of course prohibited it on a national basis. But Hamilton, growing up in the Caribbean, saw the evil of slavery on the sugarcane plantation. So unlike some of the other founding fathers, like Jefferson and Washington, who actually owned slaves, Hamilton suffered no confusion about the issue of slavery. He recognized it to be an evil system, and due to his work, and he wasn't the only one, but due to his work in the Anti-Slavery Society, we became, again, along with Pennsylvania, the first states to do it without any war. So he was a great leader in that regard. And finally, I'll just mention this and then shut up. He's really one of the great proponents of what we call the Constitution, the bedrock of the American government. Before we had the US Constitution, we had this very weak governing document known as the Articles of Confederation. And there were three things that the Constitution did over the Articles of Confederation. Number one, it created federal courts, not just state courts, because with state courts, you had this home court advantage problem. If you had a Massachusetts plaintiff suing a New York defendant in a New York court, you might get some home court advantage, so to say. So when the Constitution came along, it created federal courts, which in theory evened the playing field. It also created the Constitution a strong presidency, a strong executive, not just a ceremonial president, but a president with true executive authority. And the third thing it did was it created the taxing authority of the US government. The Constitution gave the government the right to tax its citizens. And this was played out in the Obamacare decision. It was Chief Justice Roberts, a noted conservative member of the court, who voted in favor of Obamacare, because he said that under the Constitution, courts have the right to tax it, or not the courts, government has the right to tax its citizens. So he was the only conservative member of the Supreme Court which broke with his conservative brothers and sisters and voted in favor of Obamacare. But that was because of the three things that the Constitution did, right? Again, the strong executive, taxing authority, and federal courts that created a much stronger central government. And Hamilton, along with John Jay and James Madison, wrote what are called the Federalist Papers. And these were about 85 papers, which were published in newspapers across the country, which encouraged the various 13 colonies to adopt and to ratify, that's the key word, to ratify these this proposed constitution. And because there's such a strong record of these Federalist Papers, whenever the US Supreme Court is trying to figure out what did these founding fathers mean when they created this mysteriously wonderful document known as the Constitution, what did they mean? They look to the writings of Alexander Hamilton. So to this day, he is the #1 quoted source by the US Supreme Court. The writings of Alexander Hamilton have been quoted more frequently in cases before the US Supreme Court than any other single person. So that's not a bad legacy. Would you all agree? Would you both agree?
I would certainly
Absolutely.
say so. Was the Constitution ratified in Federal Hall?
Well, what happened was you had a constitutional convention in Philadelphia, and it had to be ratified by the individual states. In Federal Hall, the original Federal Hall, you had the first 10 amendments of the US Constitution, known as the Bill of Rights. That's where they were debated. And when we say the Federal Hall, we're talking about a New York City Federal Hall on Wall Street.
Right.
When it was, New York was the capital of the nation from 1789 to 1790, just 17 months. So the Constitutional Convention itself was held in Philadelphia, is my understanding. But when they got to the notion of these 10 amendments, these Bill of Rights, that was more discussed in New York at the Federal Hall. But in both cases, each of the original Constitution and the first 10 amendments had to be ratified by the individual states in order to become federal law.
Right. Okay.
Well, Jared, I don't think we can talk about Alexander Hamilton without talking about somebody else, Aaron Burr.
Oh, well, it goes without saying that in the modern world, I didn't want to dominate the whole conversation, but it goes without saying in the modern world, LinManuel Miranda, who is a true genius, the composer, the true genius, the brainchild behind the hit musical Hamilton. It wasn't an accident that he told the story of Hamilton in that wonderful musical through the eyes of Aaron Burr,
Mm-hmm.
who, of course, it's all about who tells your story, right? In history.
Mm-hmm. Always.
And, it goes without saying that, and I'll say this and then I'll let you guys shut up. Hamilton and Burr were lifelong political opponents and ultimately enemies. Although they did work together in the famous Manhattan Well murder, the first great sensationalistic murder trial of the 1800s, they both were co-counsel and were able to win the acquittal of a man named Levi Weeks, who was accused of murdering his paramour because she was pregnant. But Hamilton and Aaron Burr both worked as co-counsel to win his acquittal, but they were political opponents. And in particular, Alexander Hamilton used his position as publisher of the New York Post newspaper to write very critical articles on Hamilton, again, about Burr. Number one, he criticized him in his presidential race against John Adams, even though Adams and Hamilton didn't get along either. Hamilton considered Burr, I'm sorry, I said John Adams, I meant Thomas Jefferson. Burr came in second in the presidential race to Thomas Jefferson. And so there was animosity there. Also, Burr later ran for governor of New York, and that was what really did it. When Hamilton used his soapbox of his New York Post newspaper to write critical comments about Burr in his race for the New York State governorship, that's what really set off Burr. That was the straw that broke the camel's back, as it were, so to say. and he challenged Hamilton to a duel. Ironically, because Hamilton's son Philip had been killed in a duel 2 years earlier, dueling was outlawed in New York State, so they had to go over to New Jersey, to Weehawken in New Jersey. And as the story goes,
Jared, do you remember what was the penalty for dueling in New York State?
Oh, I do not remember. I know it was against the law, but I don't know the penalty.
I didn't know either. What is
it? Was death.
Death?
Yes.
Oh,
wow. My gosh.
But you didn't get to do it yourself, so it was seen as
exactly.
Okay, got it.
And really, it's not the story goes. There's some debate about this, but the story goes that when they arrived at the dueling grounds, Hamilton fired his gun into the air, fired his pistol into the air, as honorable gentlemen did. They showed up because they had been challenged to a duel, but by the time the duel would come around, often cooler heads would prevail. You show up, you don't chicken out, as it were. You show up at the duel, but then you don't really try to kill the person. You discharge your firearm into the air to defend your honor, but not hurt the other person. Well, it's clear that Burr did not feel the same way, took aim at Hamilton, shot him in what is believed to be the area of the abdomen, in his gut shot, as it were. And Hamilton died. Unfortunately, the following day, he was taken by boat across the Hudson River, and he died, I believe it was in James Street, where the survivors of the Titanic actually were taken from the Carpathia. He died there the next day. And of course, his funeral, I believe, don't quote me on this 100%, but I believe it was the largest publicly attended funeral in New York City until Abraham Lincoln's funeral procession, much later, because he died in 1804, Hamilton died in 1804, and Lincoln in 1865. So now I'll shut up. I'm sorry, that was longer than 5 minutes.
But how interesting.
No, that's good. No, Hamilton really is fascinating. And I urge anybody who's listening, if you haven't seen the musical, when it comes to wherever you are, if you come to New York and it's still around, be sure to see it, because it's an absolutely masterful piece of theater, and read the book as well. The book, of course, that the musical is based on is an absolutely stunning piece of work too.
And just to make a little parenthesis on this, John, Hamilton is going to be on YouTube, I believe, or like for free on July 3rd, or is that Netflix? But they've been announcing that they're going to have it for free, like starting July 3rd, I believe, or something like that. So everybody will be able to see what you're talking about.
So that's right. You'll all have the opportunity. So please do not miss it. And of course, the thing about Hamilton and downtown is that Hamilton's all over downtown. I mean, this whole notion of the Bill of Rights, the Federalist Papers. I mean, he was doing all his work all through downtown, and so his presence is everywhere. I mean, Bank of New York's old headquarters is downtown. Of course, that's where it was when he founded it. The other thing is that he's buried at Trinity Church. He got killed in that duel, and Trinity Church is right there at the top of Wall Street, and his tomb is very prominently located there, right? So Hamilton is really sort of a ghost presence in all of downtown.
And if you need to make some change, that's a perfect place also to make some change if you want.
He did what?
It's a good place to make some change. Like if you have a dollar bill and you need some change for your dollar bill,
there you go.
Coin money right there, because
right
people throw money on his grave.
Absolutely. So yeah, it's part of the thing about downtown, right? You've got so many different layers of history. You've got Hamilton's New York, but of course, a lot of people come to New York and they're interested in history, but they're also interested in the history of finance and everything that's related to finance in downtown. I mean, the crowds in front of the stock exchange are absolutely insane, as you can imagine, right? Particularly since the statue of the fearless little girl that I'm sure you've all heard of was put in front of the stock exchange. Huge crowds, and of course, the history of finance in downtown is pretty spectacular, right? But what you notice going down there now, you don't see much physical there in terms of buildings that really reminds you of that earlier history of people like Hamilton. I mean, you've got his tomb at Trinity Church, but other than that, I mean, New York is not like Philadelphia or Boston, where you've got vast tracts of the city, of the central part of the city, that have all these colonial buildings and everything. So it's kind of a game of imagination you have to play with yourself if you really want to picture the world that somebody like Hamilton lived in. And it's interesting, there was an article in the New York Times just a few days ago, I think it was the 13th, right? That was basically a written version of a virtual tour that a columnist for the Times was doing, based on a guy's work who's involved with historic conservation and such, and what he does when he does his tours, and what he suggested doing in a book that he wrote is visiting a place particularly so filled with layers of history as downtown New York by going through a series of maps, right? Earlier, starting with the earliest maps and then working your way forward, right? So you can see what the place looked like and then get relevant pictures of the buildings and such and what it all looked like, contemporary paintings, photographs when you get into that age, right? So you can sort of picture the physical location of where you are. And in a place like downtown New York, you almost have to do that to sort of visualize all the layers of history that exist and have existed in downtown. I mean, when the Dutch came there, Manhattan, when the Dutch came into New York Harbor and discovered Manhattan, right? It didn't look anything like it looks today, right? Of course, the buildings from that period are all gone. All the buildings from Hamilton's period are basically all gone. So it really is helpful to go through old maps and old pictures. So as you go, you can sort of picture what it used to look like. And you got to make sure you look at more contemporary stuff too. I mean, not just from Hamilton's era, but all the way through modern times, because all the stuff that you see there today has significance, both in the sort of world of finance realm and also in the architectural realm, right? So understanding that aspect of downtown history is one of the things that makes it such a fascinating place as well. I mean, for instance, the Wall Street Charging Bull, right? Right across the street from something called 26 Broadway. Today, it's an office building. There's some schools in there, but that was where the Rockefellers hung out. That was the world headquarters of Standard Oil. Okay, so there, I mean, I can't even begin to tell you how many buildings there are downtown like that, that were the headquarters of some amazing company that you've heard of. The Woolworth Corporation, right? There's another building, right? Just up Broadway from 26 Broadway was the headquarters of the Woolworth Corporation. Of course, people of a certain age all went into Woolworths to buy little things and all that, right? But Woolworth building also is an architectural marvel. So there's that aspect of its history as well. So I urge all of you, when you come here and do tours, do that. Go through that exercise. Look at old maps, look at old pictures from various parts of Wall Street's history, so you can really sort of imagine what it looks like, not just today, but what it looked like in the historical periods that you're interested in.
Now, why do you think it has changed so much? Like, let's put aside the two huge fires that New York City got, through its history, that destroyed most of the city. Why is it? That's a question I get a lot from people. Like, it's like, it feels like New York City is always, under construction.
Right. Well,
why do you think? Because that's always the first thing that the tourists are telling me. Well, there's scaffolding absolutely everywhere. What's your approach?
Yeah, well, my thing, and Jared, you chime in, obviously, right? New York has its whole history is based on the harbor, right? Yeah. And what is now New York Harbor is one of the finest natural harbors in the world, right? I mean, that's why the Dutch showed up, and that's one of the main reasons they wanted to start their colony there. I mean, obviously there were beaver pelts to be sold in Europe, and they made tons of money doing that, but I mean, the main reason they wanted to establish their colony there was because New York Harbor happens to be one of the finest natural harbors in the world, right? And one of the reasons the British wanted to kick them out, right, was because it was one of the finest natural harbors in the world. So everybody knew it was going to end up being some sort of trading capital. And of course, the building of the Erie Canal and all of that sort of assured that was going to happen, right? But the place grew in importance because of all the trading that was done out of there, right? And so as it became important as a trading capital, it became the center of industry as well, and has just continued to morph in ways that Philadelphia, for instance, and Boston, which I mentioned earlier, didn't, because they weren't as powerful trading capitals. They didn't have access to all that was produced in the interior of the country the way New York Harbor did via the Erie Canal. So there was nothing to sort of incentivize continued growing and morphing, right? And with all the industry that showed up, the creation of the finance industry, which just followed where all the industrial companies were, the biggest industrial companies, which were all in New York, just continued to grow and morph. More and more people came, and of course, New York became the center of immigration. And so all that was old eventually just got rolled over and incorporated into what came after, because the place continued to grow and grow. And so that to me is why New York morphed and changed and sort of shed its skin and became something different over many different historical periods through history. I don't know, Jared, if you have any other.
I would just add a couple of quick things. When I talk about all of the quote unquote construction in New York, I think you have to separate out the types of constructions. Like I'll say to people, this could be a facade inspection. In other words, we have all these beautiful buildings in New York that have a lot of decorative work. But unfortunately, because it's a concrete jungle, if say a piece of baked clay, some terracotta ornamentation breaks away from the building and falls, it's going to fall to the sidewalk below. And this creates a safety hazard for the pedestrian. So the city of New York, through its Department of Building Inspections, has very, very severe what are called facade inspection requirements. So the facade has to be regularly updated and maintained. And often the scaffolding will be put up. The work will be done relatively quickly. The maintenance will be done relatively quickly. But then you're waiting for the building department to come around and do a final sign off. So that's why the scaffolding seems to be up in some of these locations for 1 to 2 years. And as tour guides, you either love or hate the scaffolding. Sometimes you want to get out of the rain, so you like the scaffolding, or you want to get out of the hot sun, so you like the scaffolding. But there's all sorts of construction just related to the basic requirements of maintenance, facade inspection. And there's also a tremendous amount of new construction, right? Mainly these tall, thin structures like giant pencils in the sky. These are, you're seeing them all in Manhattan, certainly along 57th Street, these ultra tall, ultra thin buildings, which have very, very narrow bases. Their building lots are very small, but they have the technology to go straight up. And most of these buildings are residential in nature. So you're seeing a lot of building boom for that. And you also see the beautiful tug between developers and preservationists in New York, like no other city. There's a tremendous tug because developers want to take, a piece of land and build something to the heavens, right? They want to maximize the use of that real estate, so they're going to construct on anything they can. On the countervailing weights, you've got the zoning laws, you've got the zoning restrictions, but you also have the preservationists. I think we have something on the order, don't quote me, but something on the order of 1,200 historically preserved buildings, such as the most classic example, the one that started it all off, was the preservation of Grand Central Terminal in the famous 1978 U.S. Supreme Court decision, which did not allow the New York Central Railroad to essentially destroy that building to build an office tower. They upheld zoning and historical preservation overlays, that they are legitimate public use to have a historic building. You can prevent people, developers, from building to the heavens. And that's what makes New York building and construction always so fascinating, is this ebb and flow, this tug of war between developers and people that realize we need to have a good tax base, right? All those ultra tall, ultra thin buildings are generating property tax revenues, right? And they create jobs. So you always have this push between the developer and the preservationist who doesn't want to move too quickly. And you even have some neighborhoods, like a classic neighborhood. Greenwich Village is a historic neighborhood. So it goes beyond just preserving the buildings. You even preserve historic neighborhoods. So if you want to build in certain neighborhoods, you have to jump through hoops. But that is such a good question, Benoit. And the final thing I'll just mention is Jon had talked about the development of the Erie Canal. A lot of people don't understand this, but why did New York as a city leapfrog over the more established cities of Boston and Philadelphia? It was very simple. In 1825, we opened up the Erie Canal. Now, what is the Erie Canal? If you look on a map of the eastern United States, we have the Appalachian Mountain chain, which goes from Maine in the north to Georgia in the south. There's only one true gap in that Appalachian Mountain chain, and that's at Albany, New York. And that's where the Hudson River was able to connect, where you were able to build this canal across a relatively flat plain in upstate New York. It did have some locks, right? The locks that allow the water to the boats to go up and down depending on whether you had natural falls or natural, I should say, land impediments. You had a series of these locks, but for the most part, there's a gap in that Appalachian chain beginning at Albany all the way out to Buffalo. And when the Erie Canal opened, it gave New York City essentially a monopoly on all the raw materials coming out of what is the Midwestern United States, like timber and grain and things of that nature. So it allowed us to grow commercially because we had essentially the only route that could get those goods out of the Midwest. And we've been growing ever since. And just the final comment is, from the arrival of the Dutch and New Amsterdam in 1624, this city has been about commerce. And you cannot have commerce without buildings and building development. Although now we'll see in the BC world, in the post-COVID world, we'll see its effect on real estate. But you've had this tug of war and this construction ever since.
This is very true, Jared. And I think this is the perfect place to sign off. Thank you so much, Jared, for all the information. Thank you, Jonathan. Everybody, please come back to see our website and see when we are live again. We're not in the street, but we're still touring. Thank you. Have a nice one.